Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Duke, and welcome to The Takeaway. Back with Alex Newman, who does great work for us, writing for the Freedom Project media site, freedomproject.com, if you want to take a look at all of our takeaways, all of Alex's wonderful articles, all of my video commentary as well. Alex, welcome back, and we've got a very important but alas, predictable issue today. We've been saying for years, one of the first things I noticed 6 years ago when I got involved with fighting Common Core was the inordinate influence of Bill Gates. Bill Gates of Microsoft fame, Bill Gates, committed leftist technocrat, Bill Gates, who believes in one world government, wants one world education, spending his vast monopolistic fortune to rig our kids' education system. And he's back at it again, acknowledging that Common Core is a failure. Talk about Bill Gates' latest plans.
Well, thanks very much, Duke. And the details are actually pretty hazy. He kind of outlined his general vision in a recent speech, and he committed to spend something like $1.7 billion on this. But as we know, we can look at what he did with Common Core. That $1.7 billion is going to be used as a catalyst to try to mobilize our money, right, our taxes, by influencing policy and by shifting resources to where he wants them. So what we do know is that he's still standing by Common Core. I mean, he's conceded that, it didn't exactly go as we planned. And, he told us a few years ago that, we won't know for a decade whether these education things worked. But anyways, he's planning to plop another $1.7 billion into this idea. And at the crux of it is the increased use of data and what he calls networks of schools. So he wants to fund what he's calling networks of schools to figure out ways to better use data to so-called improve education. And by improve education, since we're dealing with Bill Gates, I think it's a safe assumption to make that by that he means improve the indoctrination, improve the brainwashing, improve the manipulation, the data gathering, and of course the opportunities for profit for Microsoft, which of course sells a lot of the software and computer components that make this whole data gathering Orwellian Big Brother machine operate.
Yeah, it is laughable that Gates, he kind of stood by Common Core simply because he couldn't repudiate it, right? After $1.7 billion is peanuts compared to what he has spent over the last 6 years on Common Core. So the idea that he was going to completely repudiate it was not going to happen. In fact, I think what's happened here is Common Core was kind of like Obamacare. It was rushed in, it was slipped in under the cover of darkness, it was bribed into the states, blackmailed into the states through race to the top grants, the overweening control of the Department of Education. What I think Common Core was meant to be, is now when I think about it, is kind of like Obamacare, which was meant to be a impartial fix. It was getting the camel's entire hump under the tent, not just the nose, so that when it collapsed, first of all, if it worked better than people thought it was going to work, that's fine, which we knew it wouldn't. And when it finally collapsed, that would push us to single payer. It would never push us, we would never push that healthcare camel out of the tent once it had its hump in. What it meant was that we would go to full single payer. The camel would get completely in. And I think this is exactly what happened, among other things, with Common Core. For the first time in American history now, through the events that gave us No Child Left Behind, into Common Core, and now with the ESSA Act passed by Republicans in 2015, now we have for the first time an infrastructure, a legal infrastructure written into law that allows the feds to basically manipulate, oversee, use the power of the purse to bribe and coerce states to subordinate their educational responsibilities to the federal government. And so Common Core may have failed. Bill Gates, by moving in a different direction, acknowledges that it's failed. But he also now has a much easier task. He has the infrastructure for federal control firmly in place thanks to Common Core. And so 1.7 may be all he needs to use the existing roadmap in our schools to continue to take over.
That's right. And, he's very strategic about his grant making and about the way he spends his money through this foundation to get maximum bang for his buck. The amount of money that he spends on these schemes is really peanuts in comparison to what he hopes to force taxpayers to spend to implement, to monitor, to test, and to, do all of the things associated with his schemes. And we saw that with Common Core. One of the estimates that I cited in my article by Zev Vorman, you and I both serve on a board with him, it was a really insightful commentary he had. He pointed out that, yeah, Bill Gates poured some of his money in here, but really he helped misdirect $4 trillion of taxpayer dollars, of public money, through his strategic spending on getting this infrastructure in place. So he kind of put up the seed money, and then he let taxpayers foot the real bill, which, we're literally talking trillions and trillions of dollars. And as you know very well, Duke, I mean, you're the Common Core expert. I'm not sure anybody knows as much as you do on this subject. It's been an absolute disaster, and I suspect you're absolutely right. It was probably engineered that way. You're right. Now we have, for the first time in history, the Secretary of Education with purported statutory authority to approve or not approve state education plans. Right now they're threatening the state of Connecticut. They're saying, well, we're not sure we're going to approve this. You need to go back and make some changes, as if we had a national school board, when the Constitution and federal statutes specifically prohibit federal involvement in these sorts of things. So Bill Gates and his cohorts, like Obama and the globalists and the establishment types that he works with, have been incredibly successful. And it all goes along too with this globalist agenda. Common Core was an effort to nationalize education in the United States, certainly, and that had already started even before Common Core. Common Core was kind of the icing on the cake, but this had been something that UNESCO was working on for many years. Irina Bokova, the actual communist who runs UNESCO, the UN Education Agency, said that, when we started this, there was only 3 countries in the whole world that had national education standards. Now there's more than 100, and soon all of them will have. And, national standards are a prerequisite to moving toward these kind of global standards that the UN and the backers of the UN, which of course includes Bill Gates, he actually signed a partnership deal with them in 2004, 2005 to develop a master curriculum and teaching instructors how to teach, things like that. So the real agenda here is to first nationalize education in every country and then bring that all together to form this kind of global education regime. And we're seeing the contours of that emerge right this instant. Now, fortunately, Donald Trump, the Trump administration, has announced that we're going to be withdrawing from UNESCO by the end of 2018. That's a very good development, assuming they follow through. Apparently, they've already notified UNESCO that we're out. But it doesn't change the trend. It doesn't change what's already happened. Arne Duncan, Obama's education secretary, called the UNESCO his global partner in cradle-to-career education reform, all around the world. And so that's their agenda, move toward this global education system. They tell us what they want. They want dumber kids. They want brainwashed kids who believe, not just believe in sustainable development, but actually are willing to go out and promote it. And, when you realize that sustainable development is just, a fancy new marketing slogan for totalitarianism, you realize they're literally talking about brainwashing our kids to not just accept totalitarianism, but to demand it. And so, Bill Gates is very much involved in that process. His efforts absolutely must be resisted. And, we need to do everything we can to expose him and stop him.
And I think it's really important to reiterate for moms and dads maybe who are learning some of this information for the first time, that there seems to be, in Republican conservative circles, there seems to be this benighted argument that, well, nationalizing education like nationalizing healthcare, that's really ultimately a good thing, right? It's more oversight, it's more taxpayer dollars, more ability for the federal government to pay for these wonderful things like education and healthcare. But you have to understand what Alex just said, and Bill Gates has implemented in this up to the earlobes, that the reason the UN, that doesn't like nation states, the United Nations, that's not interested in preserving borders, is not interested in promoting nationalism or individuality among nations. Why is the United Nations, UNESCO, so much behind Bill Gates' plan here? Because as Alex said, before you can globalize anything, you have to nationalize it. The biggest threat to the UN globalist ideology is a strong 50 states, independent states with independent legislatures, making major decisions for the people who live in their communities, not the federal government that then can be globalized. That's part of the problem here. And while we're on it, talk a little bit, if you don't mind. Moms and dads should know, most know, that Bill Gates has no educational experience. He's never been a teacher, never been an educator. This is a guy that dropped out of college because he found it utterly worthless, opened a computer company in his garage. So he has no education credentials, which begs the question, why are we letting a rogue billionaire have this much impact over our government schools? Why are we allowing this non-educated plutocrat into our kids' classrooms at this magnitude? Because you and I both know If he were a conservative billionaire, if he were a right-wing billionaire, if he were a billionaire who believed in states' rights as opposed to the federal government, we would allow him nowhere near our kids' schools. But talk a little bit beyond his lack of education credentials, Alex. Talk a little bit about Bill Gates' lifelong commitment to globalism in the United Nations, and even his parents were involved very heavily in globalism and United Nations enterprises.
Yeah, well, Bill Gates' background, I think, is really, really troubling. You're right. His parents were involved in Planned Parenthood. He's been deeply involved in Planned Parenthood, funding Planned Parenthood. And, just for those who aren't yet aware, maybe you've been living under a rock for the last 10 years, Planned Parenthood murders more babies than any other organization in the country. We're talking hundreds of thousands of children's lives snuffed out every year by this organization, a lot of it with tax money, some of it with Bill Gates money. Bill Gates is also a fanatic about population control. He has this, Malthusian or neo-Malthusian ideology that claims there's too many people on the planet and we need to get rid of people. He had a really creepy video put up on YouTube about we need to get carbon emissions down to zero. Carbon emissions, of course, is the gas that you exhale, the gas of life. Nothing on this planet could survive without it. Wants to bring it down to zero. And so he said, we could bring population down to zero, or, we could do other things. And then, if we do a really good job with our vaccine program, then, maybe we'll get somewhere. So, this guy has an ideology that is totally at odds with, normal, everyday, mainstream Americans who love their country, love God, love the Constitution, like the founders. He has a globalist worldview. And I've heard people speculate that, maybe he got bullied into this, right? There had been some talk about the federal government possibly regulating or breaking up Microsoft for a while. And that's when he really started sinking his billions of dollars into the political process, into these philanthropic efforts. But, he has a very troubling history. As I mentioned earlier, he signed an agreement in 2004, 2005 on behalf of himself and Microsoft with Unesco to develop a global master syllabus and to develop resources for training teachers. And, education reformers, so-called, who wanted to, hijack our education, if you go back to Dewey, for example, is a very good example of this, they've understood that the real way to do it is to get to the teachers, right? Because then you don't have to get directly to the students. You can just get to the teachers, and then the teachers would do the dirty work for you. And so Bill Gates has been deeply involved in that in collaboration with UNESCO. For people to understand, because, a lot of people still have this naive belief about the UN that they learned in school. And I learned the same thing. I'm no better than anybody else. I was thoroughly brainwashed into the UN indoctrination stuff until I started digging and realizing what was going on. But I encourage people to go read some of the articles we've written at Freedom Project about the UNESCO. Check out some of the articles that I've written in other publications about UNESCO. This is a radical, incredibly extreme organization. It's been run by actual communists almost from the start. They announced almost at the beginning that one of the purposes was to prepare the world and humanity for world government by getting into the minds of children. They talk about the need for combating family attitudes. I mean, today they're literally putting out reports about textbooks saying that all textbooks all over the world need to promote homosexual parenting, the man-made global warming myth. They actually criticized the textbook in California because it pointed out the fact that some scientists disagree with the man-made global warming hypothesis, which, in my opinion, has been thoroughly discredited and was never even a legitimate hypothesis to begin with. So this is the people who Bill Gates is involved with. George Soros is another one of these types of, evil billionaires almost that, think they're going to spend their money remaking the world in their image. Soros literally walks around describing himself as some sort of god. Those are his words, not mine. And then he goes on to say he's an atheist, and then he gives a bunch of money to Christian groups to corrupt the church. So these are very, very, in my opinion, dangerous people. And, you'll have some on the left who say, well, look, you guys have the Koch brothers, right? And, we, of course, don't have the Koch brothers. But, there's a fundamental difference here in what the two different, groups of billionaires, if you will, are trying to accomplish. On the one hand, you have, people like the Kochs and maybe the Mercers and some of these others working to get government out of people's lives, right? Let's shrink the government so that it's making less decisions for us. On the other hand, you have the Bill Gates, you have the George Soros, who are trying to co-opt the apparatus of the state to use it to make decisions over our lives. So these are fundamentally different things. Bill Gates here is not just dropping his money as some sort of philanthropic effort. This is an effort to hijack our tax dollars and use them to reform so-called education in a way that's going to gather more data on our children, that's going to more effectively brainwash our children into his radical ideology. And again, there's a fundamental difference here between what's going on, and it absolutely must be opposed.
Right, and this idea, too, that you're exactly right, Alex, that with all the kind of the control we've ceded to the federal government, all the power the federal Department of Education has to bully, to blackmail, to bribe, to threaten states. You mentioned what's going on with California now, how even California, the most radical state in the union, its textbooks aren't radical enough for the educational administration in this country now. But it also makes sense to point out that Bill Gates, he would not be able to do this unless the federal government at every level agreed with him, was willing to abet and aid and underwrite and use the power of government to impel much of what Gates is planning. So this is not. In my talks, I refer to it as the worst kind of crony capitalism. It's the idea that you're allowing one billionaire with no credentials, you're giving him almost unprecedented access into the mechanisms of American life, in this case, the schools, without any representative accountability to you and me, the taxpayer. That should make you mad, even if you like your government schools. Hard to believe, but even if you think government schools are wonderful, even if you think progressive ideology is fantastic and you don't mind your elementary school kids being subjected to transgressivism, you should be very concerned that the federal government is allowing somebody like Bill Gates the ability to transform underneath the system, like they do in banana republics in third world countries, without any representative government involved whatsoever, without any accountability to you and me, the taxpayers who fund these government schools, allowing someone like Gates. And I would be, to be honest with you, just as annoyed if it were the Koch brothers or anybody else, because we have no say over that as the taxpayers. And the other thing to point out too, and I think it's really insidious, is that, think about it, if leftists like Bill Gates had come up with a global curriculum in places like Africa or Southeast Asia or South America, and managed to get into those schools, places that already have a remarkable history of nationalistic control, of centralized education. If they had put something like Common Core in Africa or South America or Southeast Asia, it would have been very difficult. There would not have been the will, even as uninterested as the American people seem to be about education. There would not have been the will to force that international system into America. They did something really insidiously smart. They started with America. They forced it into American schools. They legitimized it in America. They've gotten millions and millions of moms and dads who view the public schools primarily as 8 to 10 hours a day of daycare. That's the real issue, right? For 8 to 10 hours a day, mom and dad don't have to look after the kids. The schools are feeding them now, giving them health care. They're giving them their vaccinations and their birth control, all for mom, and it's supposedly free of charge. If we had put it in international schools first, it never would have gotten here. But now that it's here, and now that we have pioneered this program, watch how easily the globalists are able to export it to countries that already believe in highly centralized government.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Duke. And, that's what we're seeing right now. The UNESCO is trying to standardize education globally. They've got all kinds of resources. They have global education plans for how to teach reading that, my good friend and associate, the late Dr. Sam Blumenfeld, dedicated 50 years of his life to the reading issue. Said it's the most ludicrous, ridiculous, harmful thing he had ever seen in his life in terms of teaching reading. So that's what they want to do. They know that's going to mass produce illiteracy. They're putting out sex education resources. They want to teach 4-year-olds about things that I wouldn't say in any kind of company, much less to the wonderful moms and dads and other people watching this video. It's absolutely sickening. And get this, too, on top of it all, Bill Gates, if he really believed in this stuff, you would expect that he would subject his children to it first and foremost. And yet we find out that he doesn't. He sends his children to elite private schools where they wouldn't touch Common Core with a 100-foot pole, and they're proud of it. So why does he want to use our children as guinea pigs for his experiments, but he's not willing to subject his own children to the same thing he wants to subject our children to? Something is very, very wrong with that. I mean, that alone should be a big enough red flag. If it's good enough for our kids, it better be good enough for your kids, Mr. Gates. So put your kids in a government school, and then let's talk.
That's exactly right. The Bush kids are never going to labor under Common Core. The Obama kids are never going to labor under Common Core, let alone Michelle Obama's lunch program. Did you ever see the lunch menu at Sidwell Friends where the Obama kids went to school? My God, it's like thousands and thousands of calories, rich desserts. Her kids are gorging on that while your kids are supposed to eat 200 calories a day in the government schools. And this is another tie-in, isn't it, to Obamacare? I mean, it really is. The Congress, the Senate, the Republican-controlled Congress at the time, the Democrat Democrat-controlled Senate and the Democrat-held presidency under Obama, they exempted themselves from Obamacare in the same way these rich, elite establishment politicians on both sides of the aisle are never going to send their kids to these schools. They excuse themselves from Obamacare. If nationalized health care is so wonderful, the Congress of the United States should have taken it first. I would have had much more respect if the Congress of the United States and the president had said, you know what, for 2 years, we in the House, the Senate, and the White House, we're going to take national health care. We're going to show you how wonderful it is, how much it saves us in money. Only then will we ask you to take it. And at that point, you'll be begging us to take it too. But no, they exempted themselves. And it's the same thing with these educational paradigms. When you have a globalist organization like the UN involved in trying to globalize education, there's always got to be, doesn't there, that oligarchy, and you see it in the European Union, right? Now the bigwigs in Brussels who are zipping around on their private planes lecturing common Europeans about their carbon footprint. Those EU European bureaucrats in Brussels who are eating $1,000 meals on the taxpayer dime when they get together, lecturing the rest of the country about sustainability. Same thing's going to happen. Think about the UN. What's going to happen at the UN if they get global control of education, of healthcare, of everything else? They'll do what the EU is doing. And look at how hard it was for England to back out. They still really haven't formally backed out of the EU. What's going to happen when this becomes globalized and there is really no way out?
Yeah, it's a very scary prospect, in my opinion. And, we're seeing this incredible drive for centralization, and it must be resisted. Even people who think, well, I don't mind the leftist brainwashing. I don't mind this. You have to realize, all these old axioms, right? Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Once you have this centralized control mechanism, it is a fact that it is going to attract the worst type of people to it. Psychopaths, wicked men are always attracted to these centers of power where they can lord over their fellow human beings. And we see what happens when that happens, right? Look back just over the last 100 years, right? Don't even go back 1,000 years, just over the last 100 years. Who are the types of people who are attracted to this centralized control mechanism, the state, the all-powerful, the all-coercive state? People like Adolf Hitler, people like Joseph Stalin, people like Chairman Mao. So the founders of this country were very wise. They set up a central government that had almost no power, right? It had, a few responsibilities, power to declare war, to defend the union, run a post office, a couple things like that. Now we're at the point where they decide our healthcare, our education, our commerce, everything about our lives essentially now is within the purview of these policymakers, the deep state within Washington, D.C. And that's bad enough, right? I mean, you can't even get your city hall to do something when you want them to do something. Now imagine getting it done in Washington, D.C. Now the next step, of course, is at the global level, at the dictators club. If you can't get your city hall to respond to your concerns, good luck getting it done in Washington. Good luck getting it done at the UN headquarters in New York City. You are going to be a voiceless, powerless pawn. And, if that is a thought that you're comfortable with, well, go right back to sleep. Turn off this video. And, as Sam Adams would say, may posterity forget that ye were our countrymen, and may your chains set lightly upon you.
I'm really glad you brought it around to the Founding Fathers. In this era of disrepute that the Founding Fathers are suffering on college campuses and the Antifa and the media, it's good that we end there, because there's very few problems in America today, for that matter, very few problems in the world today that the Founding Fathers didn't have an answer for. I love the motto, right? E pluribus unum, out of many one. Out of many different people, we become one nation. Not one global people, one nation. One nation, diverse backgrounds come together with one culture, one ideology, one nation. That's wonderful. Now think about the modern globalist movement. It's one ring to rule them all, right? It's like Sauron in The Lord of the Rings, right? One nation of radically different people voting in democratic elections for Republican forms of government that give absolute accountability for the governance of the people to us, the people, not to the big state, versus the one ring to rule them all. Right now, at the moment, Bill Gates wears the crown of Sauron, right? George Soros is his lieutenant. You keep moving down this road, and you're going to see, without any hyperbole at all, you're going to see that kind of power being wielded. And one wonders if there are enough liberty-minded people in the world still to fight it off. Alex, thanks again for a wonderful takeaway. Great back and forth. Come to FreedomProject.com to see all of our collective work trying to keep America and the world on the right path. See you soon. If you enjoyed that video, I urge you to consider joining our new Patriot Club at freedomproject.com. I'm Dr. Duke. Thanks for watching.